Sheena Calloway was 34 years old, and by the spring of 1891 she had nothing left in the world but a name that no longer opened any doors. Her husband's older brother, Roland Calloway, had stood before the county clerk in Backerstown with a stack of debts she had never signed and a signature she could not be certain was her late husband's. And by the time the ink had dried on the ruling, the house she had scrubbed for 9 years and the garden she had coaxed out of hard clay soil belonged to him. What remained to her fit inside a tin box no bigger than a loaf of bread, $47 in coin, a wedding ring she would not part with even to eat, and a single unfinished letter in her husband's hand that explained nothing at all. So when the auctioneer at the Paloma Seca courthouse steps laughed and called out $12 for what the crowd knew only as the Fool's Light, a condemned lighthouse standing absurdly in the middle of 90 miles of sand and creosote scrub, with no sea in sight and no sea for 90 miles in any direction, Sheena raised her hand before she had fully decided to. Everyone agreed it was a foolish, even embarrassing purchase. What no one told her, what no one in that town seemed willing to tell her, was that whatever had been sealed inside that tower had been waiting, patiently, for exactly the kind of person who would climb it. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Sheena Calloway. If stories of quiet women who inherit more mystery than misfortune keep you good company on a long evening, tell us in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and let's begin. Sheena had not always been a woman of the dry country. She was raised at Cutter's Bay, a gray-shingled fishing settlement on the Massachusetts coast, where her father, Tobias Marsh, spent 30 years tending the wick and the reflectors of the harbor light before his hands grew too stiff for the climb. As a girl, Sheena had carried oil cans up the spiral stair beside him, had learned to trim a wick so it burned clean instead of smoking the glass, and had come to understand, long before she understood much else about the world, that a lighthouse was less a building than a promise. A promise that someone unseen was still awake, still watching, still willing to keep a stranger off the rocks. Her father used to tell her that the sea forgave nothing and explained nothing, and that a keeper's whole duty was to be faithful anyway, light after light, storm after storm, whether or not a single ship ever passed close enough to notice. It was a lesson that settled into her like ballast, quiet and low and steadying, and it would serve her, though she could not have known it then, on a night many years later and many hundreds of miles from any ocean at all. She married Elias Calloway at 22, a gentle, careful man who sold hardware and seed in the town of Backerstown, 3 days' ride from the nearest port, and she left the smell of salt water for the smell of turned earth without much complaint, because that is what a resourceful woman did in that country. She took root wherever she was planted and made the ground answer for it. Elias was not a wealthy man, but he was an honest one, and for 9 years their household ran on small, steady kindnesses. A debt forgiven for a struggling neighbor, a shelf of seed corn set aside for families who could not pay until harvest, a habit of listening to people the rest of the town had stopped listening to. Sheena learned to read a ledger, to nurse a fever, to shoe a mule in a pinch, and to hold her tongue in an argument until she had gathered every fact worth having, a habit that more than one neighbor mistook for meekness, and more than one neighbor later regretted mistaking. She was by every account unremarkable in the way that steady, capable people are so often called unremarkable, right up until the moment the ground gives way beneath everyone around them and they are the only one left standing. Elias died of a lung fever in the hard winter of 1890, and Sheena's grief had scarcely had time to settle before Roland arrived from the county seat with a lawyer and a claim that the store, the house, and the land had never truly belonged to his younger brother at all, but had been held, he said, against a debt owed to their late father's estate, a debt Sheena had never once heard mentioned in 9 years of marriage. The court, more sympathetic to a man with a lawyer than a widow with a ledger, sided with Roland inside of a single afternoon. Neighbors who had eaten at her table did not meet her eyes on the courthouse steps. It is a peculiar cruelty of small towns, and one worth naming plainly, that a community which prides itself on knowing everyone's business can, when it is convenient, decide overnight that it does not know you at all. Within the week, Sheena had been given 3 days to remove herself from the only home she had known as a married woman, and she has nowhere in that country left to go. It was the unfinished letter in the tin box that turned her west rather than east, back toward the sea and her father's grave. Elias had begun it not 2 months before his death, and though it broke off mid-sentence, it spoke of a stretch of desert country near a settlement called Paloma Seca, where he said his family had once held interests worth looking into, before matters are decided without you. Sheena had no way of knowing what those interests were, and every sensible instinct told her that chasing a half-finished sentence across 300 miles of dry country was exactly the kind of foolishness a grieving, penniless widow ought to avoid. But sensible instinct, she had learned from her father, was a fine servant and a poor master. And so with her $47 and her tin box she bought passage on a freight wagon heading south and west, toward a town she had never seen, in search of interests that, as it would turn out, existed nowhere in any deed office, because the true inheritance waiting for her there had never been recorded on paper at all. Paloma Seca was not much of a town when she arrived, footsore and sun-cracked, in the last week of March. A scatter of adobe and clapboard buildings along a single dusty street, a courthouse, a mercantile, a saloon, and a boarding house run by a broad, plain-spoken widow named Perpetua Vance, who took one look at Sheena's dusty black morning dress and, without being asked, set an extra plate at supper. Water was the town's whole conversation and its whole anxiety. Wells ran shallow and undependable, and every rancher within 30 miles kept one eye always on the sky, a hard fact of frontier life that most travelers only learned once and never forgot. Word around the boarding house table was that the county courthouse was auctioning off condemned and tax-forfeited properties that very Saturday, land nobody wanted, structures nobody could use, and among them, drawing snorts of laughter from the men at the mercantile, was a lighthouse. A genuine glass-topped, iron-railed lighthouse, built some 30 years before by a strange, solitary man named Osgood Faraday. Standing on a rise of high desert ground, with the nearest ocean water 90 long miles away, across some of the harshest country in the territory. No one at that table could say with any certainty why Faraday had built it, only that he had come from somewhere back east with a small fortune and a strange, fixed idea, that he had lived alone out at the light for the better part of 2 decades, and that he had vanished, simply vanished, without a body, a note, or a grave anyone could point to in the autumn of 1868. The property had passed through the county's hands ever since, too odd and too remote to interest a buyer, taxed and retaxed and finally condemned. Perpetua Vance, setting down a pot of coffee, remarked that half the town called it Faraday's Folly and the other half wouldn't say its name after dark at all. And when Sheena asked why, the older woman only shrugged in the particular way of a person who has decided long ago that some questions are safer left where they lie. Sheena went to the courthouse steps that Saturday, meaning only to watch, the way a woman with $40 to her name watches an auction, carefully from the back, with her hands folded to keep them from moving. But when the auctioneer, grinning for the crowd, called the Lighthouse parcel 1 acre of scrub and 1 fool's light 90 miles from any water that could ever make use of it, something in Sheena went very still and very awake, the way it used to go still when her father woke her in the night because the wind had turned and the light needed tending before the fishing boats came in. She thought of her father's hands trimming a wick nobody watching would ever thank him for. She thought of a promise kept anyway. And before the second bid could even be called, she heard her own voice offer $12, and heard it accepted, and stood there in the dust holding a deed to a lighthouse in a place the sea had never once reached. The men on the courthouse steps laughed the way men laugh at a joke that cost them nothing. Sheena did not laugh. She had noticed, in the instant before the gavel fell, that the county clerk handling the parcel would not quite meet her eyes, and that his hand shook faintly as he stamped the deed, a small thing, the kind of small thing her husband had taught her never to dismiss, because in a quiet town, a shaking hand is very often the loudest sound in the room. The road out to the light took her the better part of a day by borrowed mule cart, young Custy's Pell, an orphan boy who did odd work around the boarding house stables, riding along at Perpetua's insistence because, as the widow put it, a body oughtn't meet that place alone the first time. The tower rose up out of the heat shimmer of the flats long before the buildings. Around its base came into view, whitewashed and improbable, a slender finger of stone and iron pointing at a sky that had never once reflected off open water for 90 miles in any direction. Up close, the strangeness of it only deepened. The lantern room glass, 30 years unattended by any account, was clean, not merely intact, but clean, as though someone had wiped the salt-white dust from it within the week. The heavy oil reservoir in the keeper's shed, when Sheena pried the lid free, was not dry and cracked as she expected but half full, the oil dark and only lightly settled, the kind of oil that does not sit 30 years without a hand returning to check it. And pressed into the hard-packed earth just inside the door, half erased by wind but not by enough wind, was the clear print of a boot heel, smaller than a man's, fresher than a season. Custis backed toward the cart without being told to. Sheena did not. She stood in the doorway of a lighthouse 90 miles from the sea, in a country where wells ran dry and neighbors forgot your face overnight, and felt the particular, prickling certainty her father used to call the lamp feeling, the sense that somewhere close by, something was waiting on her to notice it. She did not sleep at the boarding house that first week so much as she visited it, returning each evening with her hands blistered and her apron pockets full of small, strange findings. Because once Sheena Calloway had decided a thing was worth tending, she tended it the way she had tended sick rooms and seed corn and a wick her father trusted her with at the age of 9, thoroughly and without complaint. The keeper's cottage at the tower's base had been swept, at some point in the recent past, by someone who knew exactly where the broom went. A shelf in the pantry held 2 tin cups set neatly beside each other, though the county had listed the property as unoccupied for over 20 years. And in the lantern room itself, coiled at the base of the great brass mechanism that had once turned the light, a mechanism built, like every serious coastal lighthouse of the age, around a Fresnel lens designed to bend a single small flame into a beam bright enough to be seen for miles, she found a logbook. Its leather cover softened with handling, its pages filled in a small, careful, unhurried script that did not match the wild, solitary hermit the town described. The entries began plainly enough: wind directions, oil consumption, the ordinary bookkeeping of a working light, but as Sheena worked backward through the years by lantern light, a pattern emerged that raised the hair along her arms. Osgood Faraday had not built his light to guide ships because there had never been ships to guide. He had built it, the earliest entries made plain, to answer something else entirely. A shimmering, treacherous mirage that rose off the alkali flats on certain still, hot afternoons. A false glitter of water so convincing that emigrant families crossing that stretch of desert on the old Southern Trail had again and again turned their wagons toward it, chasing a sea that was never there, and had again and again been found, too late, collapsed in the white crust of a dry lake bed. It was, Sheena would later learn from a passing surveyor at the boarding house table, simple desert physics rather than sorcery, layers of overheated air near the ground bending distant light, until the horizon itself seemed to pool into water. But knowing the cause never once made the sight less deadly to a thirsty traveler who could not tell a mirage from mercy. That same surveyor mentioned, almost in passing, that the pale salt rings still visible high on the distant hillsides marked where a real, ancient inland sea had once stood, thousands of years before any wagon train ever crossed the basin, a detail that made Faraday's chosen name for his light, and his stubborn insistence on tending it, feel far less like madness and far more like memory. Faraday's log did not dwell on geology, though. It dwelled on names. Page after page recorded them. Families steered away from the false glitter and toward the tower's true, steady flame instead, year after year. An average of 6 or 7 souls saved from the crust each season by nothing more than a light burning where a light had no business burning. Faithful in exactly the way Sheena's father had described a lighthouse must be, whether or not the person it saved ever knew to be grateful. But the entries grew stranger as the years advanced. Somewhere in the log's middle years, the careful hand began referencing not travelers but visitors, men always at night, always unnamed, asking after the spring. Sheena read the word 3 times before she understood she had never once in a week of tending the property found any water source on the land at all, and yet Faraday had written of it as though it were common knowledge between himself and whoever he addressed. Entries grew short. Are after that more clipped, more careful in a different way, the carefulness of a man choosing his words in case someone else might read them. One line, dated deep in 1867, stopped her breath entirely. SC came again today, offering to buy the acre outright. I told him what I always tell him. He did not believe me, and I do not believe he ever will. The initials meant nothing to her yet. The date, she would soon learn, meant everything. She brought the logbook to Perpetua Vance's kitchen table that same week, and watched the older woman's easy, talkative face close over like a shuttered window at the sight of it. Perpetua did not ask to read it. She only said quietly that some families in Paloma Seca had done well for themselves buying up desert land nobody else wanted, right around the time old Faraday disappeared, and that it was generally considered poor manners in that town to ask exactly how they'd known which worthless land was worth buying. When Sheena pressed further, Perpetua's eyes flicked, just once, toward the window facing the Coyle Ranch house on the ridge above town, and she changed the subject to the price of flour, in the particular deliberate way of a woman who has decided that some silences keep a person alive. It was Sheriff Amos Leadbeater, a lean, unhurried man who had held the badge in Paloma Seca for 11 years, who finally gave Sheena a name to go with the initials, though he gave it reluctantly over coffee he did not really want on the boarding house porch. Silas Coyle, he said, father to the Barnabas Coyle who now ran the largest ranch in the county, had indeed done a great deal of quiet land buying in the years around Faraday's disappearance. Always for pennies on the dollar, always land the county considered dry and worthless, and always, curiously, land that later turned out to sit within reach of the one dependable underground spring for 30 miles. A spring that fed exactly the wells the Coyle Ranch now controlled and rationed to the rest of the county at whatever price the season demanded. Under the water customs most territories followed in that era, the first to put a spring to use could often claim the strongest right to it, on paper at least, regardless of who owned the ground above, which was precisely why a man like Silas Coyle would have wanted his use of it quietly established, and quietly hidden long before any rival ever thought to ask. Leadbeater said this last part carefully, watching his coffee rather than Sheena's face, and added that a man in his position found it wiser, most years, not to go asking who might have known where that spring was before the county surveys ever found it. Sheena thought again of her father's voice, faithful anyway whether or not anyone thanks you for it. She thought that faithfulness in a place like Paloma Seca might have gotten a lonely, honest man killed. Barnabas Coyle came to the lighthouse himself on a hot, windless afternoon not 10 days after Sheena had moved her few belongings into the keeper's cottage. Arriving on a fine gray horse with 2 ranch hands trailing at a distance that was meant to look casual and did not. He was a broad, sun-reddened man with an easy smile that did not reach any further than his teeth, and he offered Sheena, without much preamble, $300 for the acre and the tower. An absurd sum, everyone in town would later agree, for a condemned property that had sold at auction for $12. Sheena, who had learned long ago to let a generous offer sit in the air until its true shape became visible, thanked him and said she would think on it, and watched his smile thin very slightly at the edges when she did not simply accept. He told her almost gently that the desert was no place for a woman alone, that wells failed without warning out that far, that accidents happened to isolated properties more often than town folk like to admit. It was not on its surface a threat. Sheena understood it as one anyway, the way she understood a shaking hand on a stamped deed. And that night she moved the logbook from the lantern room to a place sewn into the lining of her own coat, where no ranch hand's casual search would think to look. The pressure did not stay gentle for long. Within the week, the single shallow well on her property, the one Custy's Pell had helped her clear of debris her first week on the land, ran suddenly and inexplicably dry, though a boarding house hand swore he had seen it running clear only days before. A ranch hand lost his way one evening and let his cattle trample the fresh vegetable rows she had planted beside the cottage. And one night, well past midnight, Sheena woke to the unmistakable scrape of a boot on the lantern room stair below her sleeping loft, and lay perfectly still, the way her father had once told her to lie still on the harbor rocks when a strange boat came in without lights, until the sound withdrew as carefully as it had come. In tea. Morning she found the logbook's usual hiding place in the lantern room disturbed, the shelf beneath the great lens pulled slightly out of true, and understood with a cold, clear certainty that someone believed she had already found more than she had. It was Custy's Pell, of all people, who found the seam that broke the mystery wide open, on an ordinary afternoon spent helping Sheena polish 30 years of grime from the great glass lens at the tower's crown. Small for his age and endlessly curious, he had wedged himself into the narrow gap behind the lens housing chasing a dropped rag, and called down, in a voice gone suddenly careful, that the wall back there wasn't stone at all but wood painted to look like stone, and that it sounded hollow when he knocked it. Sheena climbed up beside him with her heart going hard against her ribs, and together, working a thin blade along a seam no casual visitor would ever have found, they opened a shallow cavity built into the tower's crown, no larger than a bread box, dry and undisturbed for what must have been decades. Inside lay a second logbook, far more damning than the first, along with a hand-drawn map worn soft at its folds, and a small oilcloth packet of letters. The map showed, in Faraday's same careful hand, the true location of the spring, not on Coil land at all, as the town had long assumed, but running directly beneath Sheena's own condemned acre, deep enough that no ordinary well-digger would have struck it by accident, close enough to the surface that a man who already knew where to look could sink a hidden channel and quietly bleed it toward his own ranch for 30 years without a soul the wiser. The second logbook explained, in spare, unflinching sentences, exactly how Sela's Coil had learned of the spring. Faraday, trusting a neighbor's friendly interest more than he ought to have, had once shown him the water himself, in the desperate hope of splitting its yield fairly between the ranch and the wandering emigrant families his light was built to save. Coyle had smiled, thanked him, and then spent years quietly buying up the surrounding land through other men's names, waiting only for a moment when Faraday's claim to his own acre might conveniently lapse. The final entry, dated 3 days before the county's official record of Faraday's disappearance, read simply, "SC came again tonight, not smiling this time. I have hidden what needs hiding. If I do not write again, let whoever finds this know the water was never his to take, and the light was never mine to abandon." The letters beneath it, in a different, older hand, were addressed to a sister back east who, it seemed, had never received them, and spoke of a lonely, decent man's plan to one day deed the acre to whichever stranger the light itself brought to his door, trusting, as he put it, that the sea has its own way of choosing who reaches shore. Sheena sat a long while at the top of that tower with the letters in her lap and the dry, endless desert stretching gold and merciless in every direction, and understood, finally and completely, why the county clerk's hand had shaken over her deed, why Perpetua's eyes had gone to the ridge, why a shallow well nobody could explain had gone suddenly dry the moment she stopped being easy to frighten. She understood, too, that a woman who had spent her whole life being called unremarkable was now the only living person standing between a dead man's promise and the family that had murdered him to break it. Barnabas Coyle did not wait for her to come to him a second time. He came instead at dusk 2 evenings later, with 4 riders this time instead of 2, and no pretense left in his voice at all, demanding the deed be signed over before nightfall for a sum he did not even bother naming, his easy smile gone entirely from his face. Sheena stood in the cottage doorway with Custy's Pell white-faced behind her and Sheriff Leadbeater, summoned by a message the boy had carried at a dead run 2 hours before, arriving at last along the darkening road with his rifle laid loose across his saddle and his eyes very steady on Barnabas Coyle's face. It was Sheena's voice, not the sheriff's badge, that broke the standoff. She read Faraday's final letter aloud into the desert stillness, every word of it, her father's old lesson steadying her hands as surely as it had once steadied a lamp wick in a storm. and watched something break open in Barnabas Coyle's expression that was not quite guilt and not quite fear but some exhausted mixture of both. The look of a man who has spent 30 years standing on ground he always half suspected wasn't his. The truth, once spoken plainly under a lawman's witness, could not be quietly buried a second time. Sheriff Ledbetter rode to the county seat himself within the week, the second logbook and the map in his saddlebag. The ride alone took the better part of 2 days each way, since a proper wire could only be sent from the railhead depot, and even then an answer might sit for a week before word made its way back down the line. And the resulting inquiry, though it moved with all the aching slowness of frontier justice, and though old Silas Coyle was long past any earthly court's reach, stripped Barnabas Coyle of the water rights his family had stolen and restored the spring's true, documented ownership to the acre where it had always belonged, Sheena's acre, and through her, the town's. Within the month, a public well stood where Coyle's private channel had once run in secret, and for the first time in longer than most residents of Paloma Seca could remember, water flowed to any family who needed it, at no price but the walking distance to fetch it. Sheena climbed the tower stair on a cool evening not long after, alone this time, and stood where a lonely, faithful man had once stood watching for wagons chasing a sea that did not exist, and understood, finally, that she had not stumbled into his mystery by accident. She had grown up trimming a wick for a father who never once expected thanks, had married a gentle man who forgave debts he could not afford to forgive, had been cast out by people who mistook her quiet for weakness, and had walked penniless toward a half-finished sentence in a dead man's letter because some part of her had always understood, the way her father understood it, that faithfulness kept anyway unseen and unrewarded has its own strange gravity in the end. Faraday had written that the sea has its own way of choosing who reaches shore. Sheena, standing in the light he built and died protecting 90 miles from any water at all, thought that perhaps he had been wrong about only one thing. It was never the sea doing the choosing. It was the lighthouse. It had simply been waiting for someone who knew how to listen to it. She lit the great lamp herself that night, for the first time since Faraday's death, more out of ceremony than necessity, and the light climbed out over the dark, silent flats exactly as it had for 6 or 7 grateful strangers a season for 20 faithful years. A small, stubborn flame burning where no light had any earthly business burning, faithful anyway, whether or not the desert ever thanked it for staying lit. Thank you for spending this evening with Sheena Calloway and the light that waited 30 years for the right person to climb it. If her story moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who loves a quiet mystery as much as you do and leave a comment telling us. Has your own instinct ever pulled you towards something everyone else had already written off as worthless? We read every answer and we always learn something from them. Until the next story finds you, take care of yourselves and each other.